Okay, well, welcome everybody to another Sunday afternoon class from the BYU Library Family History Center. I'm getting used to that name, so it's actually coming out without me thinking about it too much like I had to for a while. On the other hand, we're going to be talking today about genealogical research. This sounds awfully like a really, really basic thing, but I have found over the years that there's a lot of misconceptions, problems, and details that even people who have been working on their family or doing research or doing family history or doing genealogy sometimes need to refer back to get some kind of connection with reality. By the way, some not a connection with reality is that some of the images on this presentation are AI generated. And so let's get right into it. Before we get into the whole nitty gritty of this, genealogy is spelled with an A. I use this genealogy word in my internet email address, and every time I tell somebody my address, I have to spell genealogy out and make sure they spell it correctly. People tend to spell it with an O, like many of the other ologies out there. So I'm just kind of reminding everybody that we do spell it differently. And also, a nice reminder that genealogy is history. Sometimes we lose the historical perspective of genealogy, and we kind of ignore the fact that our ancestors were embedded in their history at their time. They're not contemporaries. You can't project backwards your prejudices, your customs, your beliefs, anything that you may think is just fundamental to your life is probably not apply to somebody who lived 100 or 200 or 300 years ago. And so you just have to kind of put your mind back into perspective. When we get together with my wife's family primarily, we had a nice gathering recently, and it's interesting to see the effects of time on your near relatives, the ones that you've lived with and grown up with and seen for most of your life. And you go back with that and you realize the great changes that have occurred just even physically in your near relatives. This was a gathering because one of the relatives who had been married years and years ago lived over in a foreign country, a different country, and had come for a visit, not hadn't been here for 20 years or so. And there were a lot of discussions about changes and history and what we realized and remembered from years ago. The first step is you. I really kind of emphasize that when you're talking about get into the genealogy, we don't start by jumping back 100 or 200 years and looking at a fan chart, picking up a blank space and saying, oh, I'm going to start there. A lot of experienced genealogists will be kind of drawn to the distant past. They'll spend an inordinately large amount of time out there looking for somebody in the 1700s or even down in 16 or 1500s. I mean, it's okay, and if people want to do that, I suppose that's that's all right if they do it. It's just they're missing the real overall experience of having success and finding people and having a greater degree of interest. Recently, doing research on one of my family lines is in England. I've been kind of fascinated by the occupations because it turns out that some of these people were important military figures. One of them was the director of the London Zoo. These were relatives. I had no idea that I had people out there. And one line going back, I found out that one of my ancestors was a feather merchant. And I went, okay, so what do you do with a feather merchant? So that took a little bit of research into the history. And as I found out, this feather merchant was the person who provided the feathers on the front of the horses that pulled hearses, horses and hearses. In other words, funerals were horse-drawn and the big conveyances that they had, but the horses themselves had these feathers, and the horses didn't like the feathers, so they would destroy them regularly just by banging their heads against things. So that feather merchant had quite a big business because he replaced all of those periodically. These are the kinds of things when I say you have this huge possibility of learning and finding great information if you look at genealogy as history and you look at this as your history, that it's you and it's your family and you're related to the family members. So these are kind of the questions that we would probably ask if we were getting started. First of all, who am I? It's interesting because as a genealogist and as I'm working with people in the library at Brigham Young University, to get started with people, I usually ask the same question. It's where did your family come from? You know, a lot of people say, well, we came from southern Utah. And I go, well, no, I mean, what I mean is, where did you ultimately come from? Oh, we came from Scandinavia, or we came from France, or we came from Germany, or we came from China, or we came from, and it's very interesting to get into that and begin to understand kind of this basic question as to how you understand your relationship and how you became you. One of the things our family, my children, who are now all grown and married and have their own families, one of the always constant topics is which of our physical characteristics, limitations, and abilities did we inherit? And we're always talking about comparing different things like what can you do with your thumb? And it's just a long story. So the real issue here is where did your family come from? And that's the ultimate issue. And then the secondary issue is what the stories do my ancestors hold? There's a wealth of stories out there. And if you ignore the stories and simply gather names, turn it into a kind of a name and date and place factory where you get the minimal on each person and rush on to the next person, you're missing the essence, what it is that makes this a fascinating and extremely, and in some cases, difficult pursuit. And I guess down to it is, why does my heritage matter? Why would we go through this process of learning about our families and learning about history? And to some extent, there are, of course, other answers to life besides just simply genealogical. But genealogy answers those kinds of questions and a lot more. It gives you a place and time in the history, and you understand how you became you and what were the forces and factors. Learning about your parents, whether you knew your parents or didn't know your parents, or if you didn't care for your parents, or if you dearly miss your parents today, or you have parents still alive, whatever the circumstances, as you go back in time, it begins to show you that there are patterns and there are consistencies and there are things that happened and there are attitudes and even the language itself, which comes through through your past. So in order to get into it a little bit, we need to look at things the way they are. So does your fan chart look like this to start out with? So if you have a fan chart and you open it up and you discover that you really haven't done anything or connected to your ancestors. There's obviously, and when we're doing genealogy, we have what we could call the living bridge. Many people focus on their living relatives. Those of us who use Family Search realize that the Family Search program basically makes living people invisible except to the person who contributes the name or adds the name to the family tree. So other than focusing on living people, which we should do, and we have photographs and all that. And the programs are enabling us now to give information, more information about our living families. Family Search actually creates, you'll see here on this menu, it says family tree, and then across with find following personal, it says family groups. There's also CETs, and those are trees that are coming to Family Search, but the family groups, you can form a family group of living people on Family Search, and then that group is not visible as such from outsiders of the group, but you can all see things and work together as a group. So there's ways to work with the living people, but primarily this is history. So we are moving backward in time, and we are looking at people who are dead people. Often, I think, in another kind of a side note, we sometimes use words, kind of euphemisms, when we're talking about the dead. And we say deceased or passed on or passed away or whatever. I was teaching a group of young people, I mean, really young people, like 12, 13-year-old people, and was quite into it, talking about the deceased and how the deceased were. This was what our goal was, to look and learn about the deceased. And they just sat there. I mean, it was just like they were, yeah, well, we don't know what this guy's talking about. Finally, the idea came to me, and I said, "Do you know what deceased mean?" And not one of those younger people knew what it meant. And I said, "They're dead people." And they went, "Oh, we're talking about dead people." Yeah, no, yeah, that's what we're talking about. So maybe you have this already. Maybe when you get into a program like Family Search or Ancestry, that your tree just goes back and you have all these people. But one of the things that I like to do when I begin helping someone and they come to me and ask me about somebody way back out here on the end of this fan chart here, is I ask them what they know about the people. So, in other words, if we were to go back to somebody on the outer rim out there of Henry Stapley, I would say, what do you know about the Parkinsons and the Bryants and the Stapleys and the Wilsons and all these people? And usually, unfortunately, they know very little more than the name. There are exceptions. There's lots of people out there. I deal with super experienced and super genealogy people who can probably list off all those names out of memory. But on the other end of the spectrum, and a lot more people are in that category, is that they are focusing on somebody out there that has the blank. Now, if you were to look at this chart and we looked over on the right-hand side and you see there's a blank, well, if you're looking at that for the first time and you're getting online and you're getting on Family Search and you pull this up, you may say, well, why didn't they go find this person? Well, if you look at that carefully, you'll see that and you check, if you were clicking on those names, you would find out that these people are in Wales. And secondly, they all have extremely common names. Thomas is very, very common. David is tremendously common. And this drops has already gotten back to 1791. And as a matter of fact, David Thomas and Sarah Morris were a breakthrough of a long, long, long standing blank wall there. And now we have more generations passed on David Nathan Thomas's parents, and we're still working on that one. But we aren't focusing on that. We're focusing on the entire story. And in our case, it involves research that goes beyond the perimeter of that fan chart. There's a name for it, and it's called source-centric. And that means that when we enter information into a pedigree or family tree, and that when we provide information about individuals, we should do that giving a source. The question is, where did the information come from? And the effect of this in the source, being source-centric, is that we don't add information without a source, without telling somebody where we got the information. When we focus on their family, we sometimes become possessive. And the possessive idea there is that we own our ancestors in the sense that we are the ones who found them. We're the ones who've recorded all the information, and we should be the important person because we did all the work. Well, the answer is they're not your relatives. They're everybody's. Every time you find a new person, that new person, if they were old enough to have children and they had a family, they have descendants, and all their descendants own them just as much as you do. And they could be in the tens of thousands or even into the millions of descendants of that person. So, understanding that, we need to learn to communicate the information that we get. Now, what happens? People always ask this question is I say, well, you need to give me a source. And they say, well, it wasn't my source, it was my grandmother. My grandmother told me all this. My answer is, that's your source. Just put that down on the source and tell us you got it from your grandmother. And if you can remember a date when she told you, or even whatever you can remember about when you got this information. The reason for that is that we are creating this continuity. We want to know where the information came from so that when you move on to some other area, that's someone who comes after, number one, doesn't have to repeat everything that you've done to come up with exactly the same information that you did, but that they also have an understanding of the reliability of the particular information that you're trying to convey. So what does that mean in real short English? It means if you got a name off of a census record, then you would give us the date, place, name of the census record. And so it would be like a 1920 census for Spokane, Washington. And that would be the source, the U.S. Census record for Spokane, Washington. So basically, we're just recording the information as we go along. And as I already started and talked about just real briefly in getting to know the names, it is really important to begin to understand who these people are and where these people lived and what was their engagement with their families and how did this tree structure thing come about. One of the simplest questions to ask when I see a family and I see this a person and they have the name spouse, okay, and I say the question is, okay, so how did this spouse, how did this husband or wife get married to this husband or wife? In other words, what were the factors? What were the limitations? Why do we know that this person was the right person? Because how do we know we haven't picked up two people who are totally poles apart as physically at the time they were? So let me give you kind of a hypothetical here. You're going back in time on your family tree. Let's say it's established here on Family Search or one of the other, and everybody's filled in all this extra information for you. Basically, what's happening is that you begin to pick up names because of a very, very important fact that there were common names. People do not have unique names. And once you get off on just even slightly off, you'll find out that you don't have the right family line. Well, you didn't want to spend, I suppose, I mean, you're maybe benefiting somebody's relatives, but you're not benefiting your own relatives or your own self if you start wandering off into a line that's not related to you, unless you're doing it for some other reason and you have a reason for it. Basically, what's happening here is that we want to know enough about the person to realize to the people that we're working with to make it feasible and understandable and also being able to give source citations, cite the sources where we got the information showing how these two people ever got married. Now, if they're a considerable distance apart and the date and the time is back in the 1700s or 1600s, we're going to have to be very, very careful research to establish that there was some way these two people could have connected. And the simple part of that is that people could not travel as far as they can today, and they couldn't physically travel, but they also couldn't culturally or legally travel in many cases. So if you get a certain distance apart, finding these people is much more difficult. Now, the first challenge, of course, is to find out what everybody else has already done. That's the advantage of the family search family tree. It's a cooperative, unified tree. And so if you look there, you'll find all sorts of your relatives have put in different information about all the people. Some of it reliable, some of it not so reliable. But in essence, you can see by looking at that family tree. Now, hypothetically, let's say you go back when I was started doing this 44 years ago or 43 or 4 years ago, and no computers, no on-site, no online, no access to any particular amount of information or anything other than just from the records and things that I could find for my own direct family, who, by the way, had collected a lot of information, and I had books and I had all sorts of things. But the questions, of course, were how do I fill in the blanks and what do I know? It took me what I would call in this initial survey about 15 years or so of working before I felt kind of comfortable that I had identified the core information that had been contributed by my family or was known to my family. Now, you may have exactly the polar opposite. You may turn out that your family has never done anything in genealogy, it has never done a word one, and you basically know nothing more about your parents than their names, and you are basically starting at ground zero. Your survey took a few minutes. Now, of course, with the Family Search, Family Tree, and other online resources like Ancestry and MyHeritage and Find My Past and on, all the other resources we have out there, finding out what has been done is much simplified. Now, the question, of course, that also always raises is, do you believe it? And if you do believe it, are there sources that support it? So we'll kind of get into that. So the first thing, of course, is you need to talk to your relatives and let them know about your interest in genealogy. Some of us have found out that this implies that you will be the person that they bring all their piles of paper and old photographs and things to. Some people have kind of an adverse reaction to that and even get upset. But some of us have actually benefited tremendously from that amount of information that has come. Then there's always the question of what do you do with it? But unfortunately, we're not going to have that discussion today. I've got plenty of that in other presentations about talking what we do with what we have. And so we have lots of them on our BYU Library Family History Center YouTube channel, where we now have close to 1,100 videos. So we can find a lot. But the more you talk to the relatives, the more interesting it's going to become. Some of the stories that were being told at the gathering that I referred to were things I never knew. Sometimes I think it's important that people record those. Maybe they get recorded, maybe they don't. Some great deal of interest in people's lives would come if most of us had written a journal consistently and kept the information. Now, whether or not you think it's a good idea or not, it's really important from what I've been saying to discover what's already been done. People who isolate themselves from their relatives, in a sense, and isolate themselves because they don't trust what's online or it can't be correct or whatever their reasoning is, there's still plenty of paper genealogists out there who just keep everything on their own little pile of paper and information and don't bother to try to see if someone else has already found all the people they're looking for and put them on a family tree that's on Ancestry or one of the other websites. There's no implication here from what I'm saying that I believe, or should anyone believe, that without verification and without sources being available, that the information on the online family trees is correct, but they're just there. In fact, one of the biggest challenges today is that there's a proliferation of these family trees. Literally, there are up to the millions and millions of people with family trees on Ancestry and MyHeritage and Family Search. Has people up was like 1.3 or 4 billion people on the Family Search family tree. And who knows how many floating around in the cloud around that haven't been attached. One of the challenges is, and I mentioned that you could spend a lot less time than the 15 or so years that I spent doing a initial survey. You may find out that there's enough contradictions in your initial survey that you need to kind of ground yourself and start over and gathering information. This is especially true if people have created family trees for a specific purpose. It's unfortunate, but its reality is that some people have made up the information to get to join a surname group or some other kind of historical group like the Mayflower Society or Daughters of the American Revolution or Sons of the Pioneers or Daughters of the Pioneers or any of these kinds of organizations that are out there. Almost every state has some kind of organization and people. So it goes back every time in this situation, it goes back to the issue of believability and whether or not the people who've done this work have created a information base that is fixed to provide sources so that you can go look up the sources to see if the information is correct. And most of the programs, like an Ancestry and Family Search Family and MyHeritage, and using those programs, the sources are right there. In other words, if they've added sources, they're there, and you click on them to see if you agree. Don't be surprised if you don't agree. There's not always consistency. What would we do? Where do we go with this? I suggest searching the whole world out there. That is, search Family Search, go to the Family Search Family Tree, WikiTree, Genie, and a lot of other programs out there and family trees out there. Some of these are free. Some of them are pay programs like Ancestry and MyHeritage. But if you're going to do an adequate job of determining and substantiating the work that you're doing, then if you're out there and you're saying, well, I'm using Family Search Family Tree, or I'm using Ancestry, and I don't look at the Family Search Family Tree because it's unreliable, or I've never even heard of MyHeritage, and I'm not going to go look at MyHeritage. Well, the answer is that you're certainly very much in the possibility that the research that you're doing has already been done or isn't currently being done by one of your relatives. That's somebody out there who you're related to. You may think that I came from Spain and I have no contact with Spain and I have no idea if anybody there is doing anything, and I'm going to be surprised if anybody's even out there. And the answer is, yeah, you're going to be surprised because you're going to find that there are people in Europe doing genealogy that you might not be aware of and may have done a lot more than you can imagine and may have sourced every step, and that you are going to save an abundant amount of time by simply connecting with those people. And or the other way around. You can know people in the United States who have done a tremendous amount of genealogy. But those people who have kept it in their drawers and their cabinets and their closets and have never published it online and have never shared it may as well have not have done it at all because the information is in a sense unavailable, and the time they spent has not helped or connected to the greater family out there. One thing that also is very important is to encourage people who are, and this is just coming from what I've been just saying, is encouraging people who are working on doing research in their family to communicate that by putting the information into an online family tree. Now, one of the biggest problems out there when you're thinking about what kind of problems there could be are privacy issues. And this comes up. And one thing you have to understand is a basic fundamental privilege. Dead people don't have privacy. That when you put someone on a family tree that was born in 1820 and died in 1910 or something like that, that life is history. And there's no privacy about history. Now you may say, well, I don't want anybody to know that person was a crook and he was in the state prison. Well, that's still history, and it doesn't really matter. And what does that do to change your life? Are you now somehow tainted or whatever by what your ancestor did or said? Maybe, maybe that's the problem. But on the other hand, it's still history, and it's still part of your history. And yes, I have found people who ended up in prison in my research. My answer to the question about a concern is, so what? That's their problem. It's not mine, but they're still part of the history and they're going to get recorded. And that makes it simpler to think about. We also have to recognize that there is a very consistent movement by the larger family history websites, the ones we always mention, and I've mentioned already, Family Search and My Heritage and Ancestry and Find My Past, etc., GennyNet, and you go on. But a lot of these family trees, and if you just put down family tree, online family tree, you'll find out that there's quite a long list, and especially records kept in programs and online and other programs across Europe and around the world. And we have to recognize that they have huge collections of records. And you're wasting a lot of time if you just ignore that these other programs are out there. I find a significant number of people who are familiar with Family Search or familiar with Ancestry or My Heritage or whatever it be, but are not familiar with the other programs. In other words, they know nothing about Family Search, but they know how to run their ancestry tree. Well, the answer here is that all these different websites have overlapping records. For a good example is they all have U.S. Census records. But on the other hand, they each have their own records, and they have records that no one else has. And so as you're going back and examining and trying to find records in your genealogical research, once again, you are kind of putting your head in the sand when you keep away from these other websites. Now, people go on and say, well, they're very expensive. The answer is yes, they're very expensive. But in the case of the expense of genealogical websites, I would compare that to tickets to a professional football game in the United States or a soccer game or football in Europe, like a season ticket cost or cost to subscribe to one of the online Netflix or Amazon or any of the other online entertainment movies and things. Or how about taking trips, expensive vacations, and all sorts of things. In other words, it's going to be where you place your priorities and what you're willing to dedicate to the possibility of doing genealogical research, and realize that even though it does cost X number of dollars to continue to have a subscription to Ancestry and MyHeritage and one of these other websites, that's still money spent towards your goal and your interests. And it's no different than any other interests that have considerable expenses. It's true. Most of these online tree programs have subscription fees. And it would not be surprising in the way the world is going today, that those fees might increase in the future, that they may have some adjustments upward simply to reflect what's going on in the world of economics. So yes, and as I mentioned just now, there's a reason and there's a purpose for subscribing and getting this information in the way. Now, if I had been sitting down in my home office in either Phoenix or Mesa or Scottsdale, Arizona, when I was much younger, and when I started doing genealogy, I would have been hard pressed because we were not, it's not something I would want to be spent much money on. But I would be very happy to have used something like Family Search because FamilySearch.org is free. And there's no unseen, under the counter or unknown or whatever secondary. And you're not going to find another program out there that this is like a freemium program where you get this freed up to a certain point and then you have to pay money to go further. Family Search is totally, completely free. So the economic argument about it's cost too much is really not feasible. Now, what's the other option? Well, the other option is that many of these other programs like Ancestry and MyHeritage, et cetera, are available in libraries across the United States and around the world. So you can get what they call library editions of these programs. Now, that doesn't mean you can put your family tree on the program, but you may be able to do a considerable amount of research in their holdings. And there are a lot of other online sources for information. One of the others, when we get talking about free, is that, for example, there are very large newspaper programs that are subscription programs, but there are millions and millions of newspaper records online for free, and you just have to know that they're where they are and how to get to them. The Library of Congress loc.gov, which is loc.gov, is the source for most of that information. And they have millions and millions of pages, and it's all free. And they have established free newspaper websites in every one of the 50 states in the United States. And if you can put in Ohio and then search for digital newspapers free, you'll find at least one or more sites that offer a search the newspapers for free. So understanding that, yes, there's a cost component out there, but on the other hand, that's not necessarily a factor only when you're unaware of all the things that are out there for free. Well, okay, so now here we are something. Now this does cost money every time, and you have to have a family tree in order for that to actually have any value at all. Getting a DNA test from Ancestry or MyHeritage will basically right now between $30 and $60, depending on time and what promotions they have going on. But the real value of DNA is that you begin to gather information about the greater part of your relatives. Anyone else who's taken a DNA test, if they match yours, then you have a connection there. And what these two big databases do is create a lot of connections. So if you are really totally baffled by the fact of where your ancestors came from in Europe or around the world, I would strongly suggest getting a DNA test and putting all the information you do know in a family tree. And on these two programs right now, Ancestry and MyHeritage are the ones that have the largest databases and the most records and the most connections out there with DNA. So getting involved in these two programs is probably one of the best. Now, it used to be, for example, a company called 23andMe that has a lot of interest by people on different kinds of DNA tests. Well, you might want to read the news. Just look it up and see what the condition of 23andMe is today, because they've been going through tremendous legal issues with that program. One of the things that's important in all of this when you're working online is to do some research. Find out what other people think about these programs, find out if there are any problems with putting your data on these programs. Those are questions you can answer by doing some online searching. The good advantage, of course, and the big advantage of working with programs like Family Search and MyHeritage and Ancestry is that they have used their AI assisted computer information programs to provide record matches. In other words, they've taken the information from what you get put in the family tree and they go out and look for the records. This is a cross section of part of my relatives on Ancestry, and you can see the little green icons. Each one of those means they've found records for that person. Well, if I hadn't already found all those, found up to hundreds of records for each of these people, I may want to add some more, but right now I have higher priorities than adding. So once again, just to kind of get back to basics of where we started here, is that the entries and the information that you put into your family tree, you're part of the Family Search family tree or your family tree on Ancestry, should be supported by specific historical records. Every event. If you say somebody was born in 1800, then we have to have a record that says that the person was born in 1800. If we don't have that record, we need to acknowledge that that record is not available. But if we had a death record and they say they died when they were 86 years old, then we could use the calculation and we could say they were born about whenever that number turned out to be. So there's a little bit of play back and forth. We don't have to be actually extremely specific. Learning how to do genealogy and learning more about the research process will give you the experience you need in order to substantiate your, let's say, guesses on where these people came from or when did the events occur. So now let's kind of look at some places we want to get some more information about how to do genealogical research. And this is information on the FamilySearch.org website. And it's basic information, but you might find that it is even more helpful than basic information as you dig into it. And then also we have huge websites like the Family History Guide. This is the one that my wife and I are involved with. And this kind of information gives you not only information for getting started, but this provides outlines of the structure of different places around the world, of all the different places, for example, where there are substantial genealogical records, plus an explanation of what we should do, even if there are no easily obtained genealogical records. So right here, by clicking on one of the countries, you will have an outline of where the records of that particular country are available and what it takes to get into those records. So this is an extensive way. And then, by the way, this is a free website. Now, there's another one that helps, and that is the Family Search Research Wiki. Now has 150,000 plus articles. It's basically very reliable, but it, in some cases, not as up to date as it might be. But on the other hand, the amount of information that's been accumulated here about genealogy around the world makes it a go-to place, no matter what your level of genealogical experience is. The BYU Library Family History Center is on the Brigham Young University campus in Provo, Utah, which is about 45 miles south of Salt Lake City, Utah, where the Family Search Library is, the one that you probably have heard about if you've been doing any genealogy. We share all of the online resources of the Salt Lake Library, and this is a large, developed, and quite a prominent university library, in addition to the information that's contained in the part of the library that's dedicated to the family history department. So we have a ton of records. And one of those sources for records is right here. And to get the information is to find help. And that is if you click on that link for the Family History Library, you'll be looking at a link to our virtual help desk where you can talk to us on a one-by-one basis. And then when you click there, then you're actually, as they said at the beginning of this introduction, but not on this recording here, this is open during these hours currently, and it's Mountain Time, and right now it's Mountain Daylight Time, but it's 10 to 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and Friday you can reconstruct the time by your own time zone as to when we'd be online. And we have people there in person to answer questions. If it's someone you need to get a question of, you can also use someone's with the instructions. You can see how to do that, and that you can arrange by appointment to meet on that virtual help desk. We go to what's called a breakout room, and then we can talk and interact. So this is a way to get straight one-on-one research help from me or any one of the other missionary volunteers there at the library. And we are very in-depth on languages. This is, I would say, this is a partial list. What this is a list of people that are there in the library on those days and speak or understand or know how to do the research in all of these different areas. And that does not mean we're confined to that, because we have a tremendous base at BYU in people who speak different languages around the world. Okay, so summarizing this, start with yourself, talk to relatives, organize your work, use a variety of records, go through all of this process. Basically start discovering what and how your ancestors lived. Okay, thanks for watching.